Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Barry Lynn, the Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute. Barry, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Nick.
Yeah, man, I've been excited to pick your brain on what I consider to be one of the most important issues in America today, perhaps in the world today, which is this idea of concentration of economic power. And I know you've done a lot of thinking on that. I guess a good place to start would be, tell me more about the Open Markets Institute. What are you all focused on there?
Yes, yeah. So the Open Markets Institute, we are the only group in Washington, actually in the United States, that is really 100% focused on the concentration of economic power and both the harms that are caused by this concentration, the economic harms, the political harms, the threats to the systems on which we depend, and also on the solutions. Sort of what can we do, and not just how do we solve the problems, but in solving the problems, actually, how can we make the world a better place? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And does the Open Markets Institute engage in like political advocacy type work, or what is the thrust? Is it more of a think tank, or both, or
We're
what?
more of a think tank, so we do. I'm a journalist. I worked abroad. I worked in South America. I ran a magazine called Global Business for 7 years. So I see myself primarily as a journalist. Most of the people that we hire them to be journalists. But we have about 4 or 5 lawyers who work with us, and the lawyers are. A reporter and a lawyer, it's actually a very similar task. You go out and you gather information, you make a case, you make a story, and you tell it, right? So it's quite. So we treat them to some extent. We treat our reporters like lawyers, and we treat our lawyers like reporters. Um, but then what we do is we gather information, we tell stories, and then we carry the stories out to policymakers, people in Congress. We carry it out to law enforcers, people who are at the Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commission here in Washington, and we do this also in states across the United States, and we do quite a bit of work also in Europe. And we've had some huge successes. This is the world's not necessarily. We haven't fixed everything. We haven't fixed most of the problems, but we've had some big successes.
Yeah, and we should get into those. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, how did you get interested in this topic? Sounds like you were covering more than just anti-monopoly type stuff in your career. How did you come to believe this is such an important issue and choose to dedicate your life to it?
Yeah, no, it goes back. That's a great question. It goes back 25 years. It was when I was running that magazine called Global Business, and uh, this was back in the 1990s. It was after NAFTA, after the establishment of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and there were all these new rules that were governing trade. How countries organize industrial systems, and it was a very exciting time, and corporations were going through this radical transformation. They were offshoring things, they were outsourcing production, they were figuring out how to tie all this stuff together through logistics. And it was a very exciting time. In the magazine that I edited, we were right in the middle of it. We were learning how these corporations were revolutionizing their structures for this new world. And then there was this earthquake in Taiwan, September 21, 1999. And within a couple of days, all of these factories around the world started to shut down. Factories in Texas, factories in California, in Japan, and China, and Germany. And the reason they were shutting down was because the earthquake had broken the supply of semiconductors from a town called Sinju, which is outside of Taipei. And it luckily the foundries where they make the semiconductors, they hadn't been damaged. It was just the airport didn't have any power, so they couldn't fly these chips to these factories. But what the earthquake proved was that this activity, this manufacturing of high-end semiconductors, which had been spread all around among 20 different corporations with foundries in 40 different places. Suddenly, this one type of semiconductor, almost all of this high-end semiconductor is being made in one place. So that was a revelation of that. It was a revelation that we had kind of stopped enforcing competition policy in the ways we had traditionally. There'd been a revolution in structure. So that's how I got into this. Is suddenly this event happened, and it showed us that there was such an extreme concentration of industrial capacity, in this case to make semiconductors, that we had missed something as a society. And so I started to dig into it, and eventually came to the conclusion that the problem had more to do with the way we do competition policy than how we do trade policy. The problem wasn't globalization; it was that we weren't promoting competition, and that was the beginning of the whole process. And then we just, I kind of expanded to looking at the political effects, looking at the economic effects, looking at how looking at platforms, Google and Facebook and Amazon, once they sort of really began to emerge. But that's how it started, was with that earthquake in Taiwan.
That's fascinating. Okay, so that's 1999. And I think, if I remember right from the research I did, that you ended up writing a book that became super interesting to people during COVID about sort of one of the themes of which would have been supply chain fragility. I'm pretty sure that book came out before COVID, right?
Yeah, actually, yeah. So I wrote the book actually came out. So this semiconductor crash, this industrial crash back in 1999, I first wrote about it in Harper's in 2002. It was on the cover of Harper's. And then I wrote a book called End of the Line that came out in 2005. And basically, during the COVID, during the pandemic, we saw all of these disruptions in our supply chains. We saw semiconductor disruptions, but then transportation. It was the ocean shipping and railroads, and just all these factory systems sort of shut down. So all these things that we saw the last starting in 2020, they were all foreseeable in 1999. I wrote about it in 2002. I wrote about it in a full book in 2005. So that's probably what you're thinking about. Is that book was it was a little ahead of its time, but it got a lot of attention. One of the things I learned, besides, is how stubborn people are about not changing something, even when you could prove it's broken, until it actually breaks.
Yeah, they want it. They got to have proof that that it's broken. Yeah, because that's quite a bit of time, right? Like there was obviously already a concentration problem in that industry in 1999, and in the next 20 years, it just got more and more concentrated and got into more and more industries, and to where we got to the COVID era, where you had a massive breakdown and arguably unleashed this inflation upon the world.
Yeah, no. If I think about that, because in 2005, I was meeting when my book came out. I had meetings with the Bush administration. I met with the highest level people in the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. I met with folks at the Department of high level folks at Department of Defense, at the CIA. This was 2005, 2006, and people were really very. They understood it. Anyone who was not an economist could understand this immediately, because anyone using common sense would say you don't put all your eggs in one basket. But it's and I keep thinking about back then it would have been so easy to fix these problems, and now you jump ahead 20 years, 18 years, 20 years, and suddenly you end up with systemic problems that are very difficult to untangle, and right now it's, the Biden administration has actually done a remarkable job of fixing some of these problems. Congress has even helped. I mean, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was the use of cash. It's like that's $800 billion that they're using to break concentrations of capacity in the manufacture of batteries, to break concentrations of capacity in the manufacture of the components of electric vehicles. And the CHIPS Act, that's $50 billion to break concentration of capacity in semiconductor manufacturing. So they're out there doing amazing things, and they very successfully. But there's so much more that remains to be done now.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the enforcement question because I was fascinated as I was preparing for this discussion and learning the fact that up until very recently, up until like the Live Nation case, we hadn't seen any meaningful antitrust enforcement in America in like several decades. Like, what is the story there? How did that get started? And how did it go for so long before people sort of woke up and said, "Hey, there's a competition or an anti-competition problem in America"?
Yeah. No, this is a, and that's the thing, is that was when I first saw that earthquake in 1999. I'm like, how could this be? This doesn't make any sense, because we're human beings. We're logical. We understand that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So initially, I thought, well, there must be some intent here. And then ultimately, I realized, no, there wasn't any intent. People just didn't pay attention. And the reason we didn't pay attention is because early in 1981, this is the early days of the Reagan administration, we radically changed how we pursue competition policy, antitrust. So from the founding, from 1776 until 1981, we used anti-monopoly law to protect our democracy against concentrations of power. We used anti-monopoly law to protect our liberties as individuals, against, to go out and be able to communicate with who we want, to sell to who we want, and to build the businesses that we want to build. And in the early days of Reagan, this group of kind of radical libertarian economists said, no, this is too costly. This is too wasteful. We should instead be promoting concentration in order to be more efficient. And if we're more efficient, we'll all have more stuff. So what they did is they took a system that was designed to protect us as citizens, and they literally changed it to be a system that promotes our welfare as consumers. They actually created the consumer welfare test. So that was 1981. And that was truly revolutionary, because competition policy, it's competition is everywhere in society. So competition policy is how we organize our society. It's not, we tend to think of antitrust as something in a silo, something that's very limited, but it's everything that government does. Ideally, everything that government does should be geared towards making you more free, making your family more free to speak with who you want, more free to do business with who you want. But what happened is, in this case, government stopped doing that, and we wake up and corporations control pretty much every single part of our political economy. It didn't used to be this way, but it is this way today.
Yeah, that's right. They control. In the recent decades, they took control even over the information flows, and that's probably the most concerning of
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. So then what happened? I mean, so people started so like I said before, I started to really focus on this 20 years ago, and I really started to focus on the political components of this, the anti-monopoly parts, in 2006. And it took us a while, but in 2016, our big breakthrough, what sort of got us on the map, was Senator Warren gave us a speech. It was June 29th, 2016. We hosted the speech. That's why I remember the date. So we helped Senator Warren write the speech. And so she gave us a speech June 29th, 2016. It was 3 days after Brexit. And she said, we have in America a monopoly crisis, and it threatens us economically, it threatens us politically. And that changed the conversation in Washington. It's rare that a speech changes the conversation, but that speech changed the conversation to put this issue on the map. And it put it on the map for the Democratic Party. But it also it even put it on the map to some extent for the Republican Party. In 2016, then candidate Trump began to actually start to talk about a lot of these issues. So we saw the first changes in how we attempt to enforce the law under Trump. It was precipitated by Warren, but the first efforts began under Trump. They weren't very organized. But then the big changes came when Biden came in, and he hired a bunch of our people and basically embraced our philosophy.
And he's been the Biden administration has been attempting to implement, as you mentioned, some of the pillars of the strategy, like, hey, let's try to bring back industrial capacity in certain key sectors to America and break the backs of these multinational monopolies, but not all of it,
Yeah.
right? It's like he stepped into it, or the administration has stepped into it, but there's quite a bit of work done. What is the work that still needs to be done?
Yeah, so you mentioned Live Nation, right? So Live Nation was something where actually the Bush administration was doing the right thing, and they looked like they were going to block the Live Nation Ticketmaster merger back in 2008. And then it was when Obama took power, they actually let it go through. It was one of the very first things that Obama did was let that merger go through. His people. Obama didn't himself do it. So the most important thing that they've done is actually that the Biden administration has done is embrace they've gone back to the philosophy of the past. I mean, there are some benefits to having an 82-year-old president. One of the benefits of having an 82-year-old president was when you say, hey, do you remember back before Reagan? He says, yeah, I remember that really well. And when we basically went to President Biden and said, hey, we got this monopoly problem, and it's because of this guy, Robert Bork, and it's because of what Reagan did with Bork in 81, it's Biden remembered every moment of those fights from back in the 80s. So he became our best friend. And so the most important thing is he said, we're going back to the way Jefferson did it. We're going back to the way Madison did it. We're going back to the way Lincoln did this. We're going back to the way that Brandeis did this. We're going back to the way FDR and Truman pursued anti-monopoly policy. So that at the philosophical change is fantastically important. But then the other thing is he's hired great people to run the Federal Trade Commission, to run the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. That's Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. Hired a fantastic person to run the United States Trade Representative's Office, which is all the trade policy. That's Catherine Tai. He's hired truly terrific people. And it's one of the sad things about this administration is they've revolutionized this policy and they haven't hardly gotten any credit for it. I mean, it's we all know it. Those of us in the middle of it understand it, but it hasn't been picked up really by the press, with a few exceptions. It hasn't really been picked up. It's a true revolution, and it's a revolution that hardly anyone knows about.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that, let's say that President Trump wins again, do you think that he would continue this ideological revolution and pursue these anti-monopoly measures, or do you think he backs away from it?
It's a good question. I mean, the last time around in 2017 when he took power, there was a pretty organized effort to get his administration to do the right thing on competition policy. And this actually goes back to Orrin Hatch, who used to be the senator from Utah, was one of the few Republicans who really kind of understood this issue. And so Orrin Hatch and this kind of the people in Utah have a real focus on anti-monopoly, and they kind of wired up the administration. but then a couple of things went wrong, and they just never hit their stride. Uh, my they, yeah, my sense is that would likely, unfortunately, be the outcome again. Is we'd end up with um, one or two or three, decent moves here or there, but generally they probably it won't be systematic in the way that Biden's effort is.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things as I've been thinking about this issue that keeps coming to my mind is that I'm in favor of like the moves that the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act represent. I feel like that is smart national policy. There's like tons of reason to back it, and I'm all in favor of anti-monopoly enforcement. And I find it interesting that the Biden administration chose to go after Live Nation. Like I get it, the Live Nation Ticketmaster thing is represents sort of a consumer pain point, and maybe a bunch of people in Washington got messed up when they tried to buy the Taylor Swift tickets and all that stuff. But we have these other monopolies out there that are like way more problematic, like Meta and Google and Amazon, and these are things that are impacting people every day, not just once or twice a year when they try to attend a live event. Like, do you think that those type of monopolies are on the table, or do they just wield too much political power in DC and they're just never going to be addressed?
No, I think it's you're right. I mean, I do think it's like that. Um, in terms of going after the Live Nation Ticketmaster, part of it was this people felt that would be popular. It's because there have been a number of cases in which people felt like the prices of tickets were manipulated, or all the independent. One of the areas where you see a lot of opposition to Ticketmaster, Live Nation, is in the independent venues. So there's the people who still run your local concert hall, that's the local club that's independent. They are unified in their opposition to Ticketmaster, Live Nation. But you're right. I mean, it's like in the great scheme of things, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, each in their own ways poses threats to the republic, threats to our democracy, and some of them to a greater degree. With Facebook and the disinformation, the shutting down of news. Same with Google. It's so now. The one thing though is that the Department of Justice and the FTC have actually brought cases against all of these corporations. So they're not backing off. So like with the Department of Justice, they brought a case against Google last year on search, which is like, and it's a very strong case. And they're bringing a second case this September. They'll be starting arguments in September against ad tech. They're going right at the heart of Google's power. The Department of Justice has also gone after Apple. FTC has brought a very wide-ranging case against Amazon. The FTC back in 2020 sort of launched a case against Facebook, which is ongoing, which is basically calling for the breaking off of Instagram from Facebook, and so they have been devoting, I'd say, most of their resources to taking on the big corporations, but they also have to deal with these other. They have to, if a pharmaceutical company is going to do a deal that's going to drive up the price of drugs in a dangerous way, if they have the resources, they have to step in. So they're trying to create a balance here, and I think that's what they were doing when they thought about Live Nation.
Interesting. And I feel like in the case of these big ones that you just mentioned, the feeling that I get as a sort of just as observer and not someone who's really in the weeds on understanding the merits of these various cases and the theory behind them is that it almost feels like the antitrust enforcement efforts of the EU and the United States are looked at as like a cost of doing business.
Yeah.
Like they're just going to do it. Like these companies have gotten so big and they have so much cash on their balance sheet that so what if they get a $500 million fine from the FTC or from the EU antitrust authorities? They're just going to pay it, and nothing really is going to change in their business model. But am I thinking about it in too pessimistic of a way?
No, no. Actually, criticism. It's we. I would say that we in the past would have agreed with you very much. In fact, this is probably more true of the Europeans. I mean, one way to look at it is that 8 years ago, the Europeans really started to up their game, but they upped their game by bringing these big fines against Google, and against the other. And then that raises the question: even if it's a $5 billion fine, when you're dealing with a $1 trillion corporation, does it really matter, or is it just a cost of doing business? But to the Europeans' credit, they started to become much more aggressive, and that's the first step. And then that allowed when the Americans came in, when Biden's people came in, they upped the game by going after structural fixes. They said, we're not going to go after fines. We're going to aim to break these corporations apart, change how they behave. So that was a whole step up. And then what we've done the last 3 years is we've carried the new American philosophy to Europe, and we've said to the Europeans, now you got to up your game. And we had the head antitrust enforcer of Europe speak at our event 10 days ago, Margaret Vestager, and she's basically more or less, directly said, we in Europe have not been strong enough. We need to be stronger. We need to up our game. So your point is dead on. I mean, it's like until recently, antitrust enforcement has been a cost of doing business for the big corporations. But we've made huge advances in getting the enforcers to up their game to the point where what they're threatening will not just hurt these corporations, but actually change them.
Yeah, interesting. And it seems like the economy is evolving so fast, like it always does, I guess, in the modern era, where there's another threat that could be, just as bad, if not worse, than the internet. The internet's been for like journalism, for example, which is this AI stuff, and the Americans are hinting at attempting to address that, but it sounds like they're not really doing enough, or at least not yet, in addressing the threat of the concentration of AI power. What is your take on that?
Yeah, no, AI is it's the issue right now in this space, and it's not always for the reasons that we see in the press. It's a lot of the stuff we read in the press is maybe sort of exaggerated. What's not exaggerated is the fact that AI is being used to further concentrate power in the hands of Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, especially, right? And it's being used very intentionally by those corporations to make themselves more powerful vis-a-vis other companies and vis-a-vis us, their users. So we put out a report on AI last November. It was called AI in the Public Interest, and we focused on this issue very closely. I'd say that what we've seen is that the DOJ, Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, they understand this issue. They pretty much agree with us. The enforcers in Europe and the enforcers in the UK pretty much agree with us. The Parliament in Europe agrees with us. Where we have had a problem is in Congress here in America. And it's Congress, and this is a bipartisan problem. It's not like the Republicans are blocking it. The Democrats are blocking it. There's a group of Republican and Democrats who are working together to block actual reform. And So is it, could I say, swear to you that these people fully understand what they're doing and what the implications of their failure to push reform are? I couldn't swear that they understand, but there is this bipartisan group that's blocking reform.
And do you think that just is a reflection of the sort of raw economic power that these mega corporations have in the political process with super PACs and stuff like that?
I would say yes. I mean, it's there's been a couple of times, but there's been a couple of times they have threatened very overtly to use their political power against particular senators, against particular Congress people, members of Congress. So it's, you know, when a corporation does that, and it's like in the last weeks of an election, a tight election, it's hard for any politician to go at them. But the day after the election, if you still find you're in power, you really have to get your act together and deal with the people who just threatened your democracy. So
Yeah.
again, it's an iterative process. It's a learning process. It's we've from where we stand, it's like 8 years ago there was nothing, and now we have this real important movement and this awakening that's taking place. But it's incomplete. We have so much more work to do. I think that Congress, next 4 years, I think we can get a lot done.
Yeah. There's this incredible clip that I came across maybe a year or two ago of a prominent venture capitalist guy you're probably familiar with named Peter Thiel, he's in a classroom, I believe, and he's talking about this ethos in Silicon Valley where they're deliberately pursuing monopoly. And there's nothing wrong. He's just stating a fact. Like that, I'm not an anti, Peter Thiel person. He was my teacher actually back in the day when I was in Stanford Law School. But I think he makes a great point. Like it sounds like over his career, basically, there was so little antitrust enforcement, and at the same time, Silicon Valley is going crazy that became the move. Like the whole idea of a unicorn, right, is to carve out a monopoly and then make it as big as you possibly can. That has been like the main driver of investment returns in America for several decades at least, right?
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I mean, basically, since Reagan came along, since 1981, if you go to business school, uh, you're going to learn that if you go to Harvard Business School, if you go to Stanford, you're going to be taught that the way to make big money is you get a monopoly. That's the what you're aiming at, and don't let anyone stop you. And until recently, no one tried to stop you. So it's like it was pretty much you know, you had to fight your way to the top, but once you got to the top, you could stay there unmolested for a long time. Um, Now, when it comes to technology, when it comes to Amazon and its sale of books, or you know Google search, or a lot of the networks that we see online, the platforms we see online, you know there is an argument which I find very compelling that these are to some extent natural monopolies, that you have network effects. And like back in the day, 100 years ago, we had AT&T, the telephone and telegraph company, and they some people say that, well, they have too much power. So then the question becomes, what do you do with them? Do you chop them into little pieces, or do you regulate them in ways that ensure that the power is used for good and not bad? And people said, well, we can't really chop it into pieces. It's the telephone network. If we chop it into pieces, it becomes unworkable. So they said, well, we're going to regulate it so that it works for us. And so I'd say that with a lot of the parts of Google, a lot of the parts of Facebook, a lot of the parts of Amazon and Apple, they're kind of natural monopolies. They're networks. And so that we don't necessarily, Peter Thiel, in that sense is like, well, it doesn't make sense to try and chop these things to pieces. Um, but we can limit what they buy, what they leverage, and we can also limit what they do, how they operate, how they exercise power over the people who depend on them. And we can make it so that they actually provide services to the people who depend on them rather than trying to manipulate and extract value from the people who depend on them, us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like there's in the modern era, the antitrust enforcement game we may want it to look differently than what was envisioned at the turn of the last century when Teddy Roosevelt was supporting like the Sherman Antitrust Act, because there is a sense in which we want to encourage these entrepreneurs to go and create incredible things, and if they need a temporary natural monopoly to do so and have incredible returns for a period of time, then so be it. And then maybe once it's established, there's a different way of looking at it, because these things, I'm not I don't want to downplay the value that these companies have brought into the world. It's incredible, and the question is now there are side effects, and the side effects need to be dealt with as well, because it's unfair to some people and to many people actually.
Yeah, no, no, exactly. And it's like you want the benefits, but then you want to make sure that at a certain point you have to regulate in a way that you continue to get the benefits and you reduce the burdens and the harms. And this is actually this stuff. The basic rules are pretty old. They've been around for a long time. It's like we can trace a lot of this regulatory approach back to the 17th century. The It's 400 years ago this year in London, in the Parliament, they passed a statute of monopolies, and it was, it was like you, the king, cannot create monopolies as you see fit, and the monopolies themselves have to be regulated. That's 400 years ago that law was passed, and it wasn't just an issue of chopping things up. It was also, it's how they behave. And so, what's weird, what's really weird, is not that we used to do these things 400 years ago. It's that we stopped doing them 20 years ago. So we tend to think, people always think, oh, we're the smartest generation. And I actually, when it comes to anti-monopoly, no, we're not the smartest generation. We've made some big mistakes. We took lessons that we learned over the course of hundreds of years, and we threw those lessons out, and now we're relearning them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's serious stuff too, because we live in a culture and a generation that thinks that economics and business is some sort of like magical separate sphere, and that politics is its own sphere. But you've written a lot about this and talked a lot about this in your public appearances, like that they're so related that you can't talk about one with the other. And in fact, it was the whole science was originally called political economy for a reason, because the people like Adam Smith and Ricardo who were thinking about this, they knew that there was really no separation between these spheres. You can't have an economy without a government and vice versa. And what's crazy about our generation is that these companies are so powerful globally that they are beyond like even what a king could do. Like the countries that don't, or the companies that don't have a home. They may have been started here in Google, but in America, for example, in the case of Google, but they're making money everywhere, and they don't have the same sort of natural national sovereignty kind of feel that a king-based monopoly would have had 400 years ago. And there are political consequences for that, in my view.
Oh, absolutely. It's a fantastic moment right now. Just last Monday, July 1st, the Supreme Court had these two decisions. One of them was about the immunity of the president for actions that he or she takes in office. And the court said, and I'd say they probably went a little bit too far, but the court said, there were balances that they disrupted. But they said the president essentially has full immunity for any official actions that he or she takes while in office. And after that decision, Justice Sotomayor said, well, the majority just essentially established the president as a king above the law. Within an hour, a different case was decided. And this was a case that was called Moody versus Net Choice. And it was basically about whether the states, in this case, Florida and Texas, have a right to apply certain kinds of common carrier style regulations to Google and Facebook. And this is exactly the lesson of the past, is we want to apply common carrier style regulations, which means you, Google, you, Facebook, you can't manipulate the people that depend on you. That's, you have to treat everybody the same. You have to give them the same service, the same price. You have to be fair to everybody. And it was the other justices. It was Justice Kagan, especially, who wrote an opinion, but it was joined by Justice, Justice Republican justices as well. But there were about 5 that came together and said, more or less, that we actually think that Google and Facebook have First Amendment rights to treat you however they want to. And so these 2 cases, the first one, there was a giant uproar because, the court says Trump can act like a king. That's not exactly true. It's not exactly what they said, and it's not the full implication. What they did with Google and Facebook is they said, well, you guys can also act like kings. You can do whatever you want. You have full prerogative to treat people however you wish. That was truly terrifying. So it was the liberals on the court who got it wrong.
That's interesting. Yeah. I didn't even hear the story about that. I had been tracking some other cases, like the one on the homeless anti-encampment stuff. I didn't realize that was issued on the same day, but I'm definitely going to have to look into that, because it sounds like it's sort of an existential challenge to the idea that you could regulate these 2 entities effectively, right?
We got lucky because what happened is on that, with the Supreme Court, there's all these technicalities in the decisions, and the technical point on which the decision was made was they just said they threw it back to the lower courts. And then everything that Kagan said in her decision, it ended up, it's her personal opinion. It's what they call dicta. And so it doesn't actually carry the force of law. So so there's good news, which is that this decision doesn't carry the force of law, but there's bad news, which is that a majority of the members of the court, all the progressives and a couple of the conservatives, are willing to don't understand what Google is. They don't understand their power. They don't understand, the American traditions for dealing with other communications and transportation platforms in the past. So that's the bad news. But we got a breather. It's not an immediate existential threat, this decision, but it's certainly a warning about how poorly many of our experts understand the actual issues.
Okay. So it's like that case could make its way back and be very consequential if
exactly. We're tracking this very, very closely. So this is
Okay. So you've worked obviously in this space, which is it's a tough space to work in as a journalist and as a nonprofit think tank leader, because of who you're up against. These are the most powerful, financially, the most powerful, and arguably politically most powerful corporations in human history. What are they saying? Like, do they even care that this fight is happening and they're just going to do their own thing? Are they sympathetic to any of the arguments that folks like you've been making?
Well, it's they do get upset, and I can speak to this from personal experience. In 2017, my organization, we're now about 20 people. Back then, we were 5 people, and we were at a different organization. It was called New America. We were a unit within another think tank. And in 2017, we made a statement about Google's power. And Google gave a decent amount of money to different parts of New America, not to us, but to other parts of New America. And so they basically ordered or convinced the leaders of that organization to kick us out. So in 2017, our 5 people, including 3 people in their 20s, were kicked out of our home because of going against Google. So yeah, they have thin skins. In 2018, Facebook went after us in public. They know how to target people. That's what they do, right? So they actually hired a group called the Definers to go after us, and they went after us for being simultaneously. They told some people that we were tools of international Jewry. They told other people that we were anti-Semitic, just to try and smear us, right? So so there's consequences for going after these people. I know a lot of folks. We got lucky, both cases. We got the stories into the New York Times. We got lucky. Other people don't. What's interesting is many of the individual people within these corporations agree with us completely. So it's corporations are made up of groups of people, and I'd say like inside Google, there's probably a couple hundred that really kind of want us out of the way, and probably most of the rest of them would kind of like us to succeed. They want to live in the world that we advocate for. And I'd say the same is probably true in Facebook. You're probably 90+% of the people that work at Facebook want to live in the world that we are trying to create. It's the world's a complicated place, and when we go after these corporations for their actions or for their efforts to retaliate, we understand it's only a few people who are really responsible, and so I'd say, one of the reasons that we know we are winning and that we are convinced, we know that we will ultimately win is because the great majority of Americans completely agree with our goals.
Yeah. To me, it's a serious topic because I've been thinking a lot about like Eisenhower's farewell address and his concern about the military-industrial complex, and everyone's favorite conspiracy theory in America is that like the Kennedy brothers were assassinated because they represented a threat to the military-industrial complex, and maybe that's true, and maybe if Trump wins, he'll release the files and we'll find out the truth. But it strikes me that an American political figure, even if he or she were incredibly popular, would potentially be a great danger of taking this line of thinking all the way, because of just how much money's at stake. Now that we've let these companies be worth trillions, like that's basically what's at stake here. And it's not that they would go to zero, but holy cow! But do you feel like there's that kind of a threat to a political leader attempting to take a strong stance on this issue, or is that overblown?
I think sometimes you think that we certainly seen the way these people use power. First, when it comes to the military-industrial complex, right now, today, 2024, who's the biggest threat to the military-industrial complex? It would be the incompetence of Boeing. The incompetence of Raytheon. The people who are destroying these corporations are the management structures. It's just that they've forgotten how to make things, right? So, we give them all this money and we don't get weapons out. We don't get airplanes that work out the door, so it's, the government made a mistake by letting them merge to the point where they can't manage, I'm not that worried about military industrial complex at this point. Google, Facebook, Microsoft. I am sometimes shocked, honestly, by the lack of respect that the corporations themselves will show for our democracy. This is but at the same time, it's like if you're going to go after, if someone were to do this, and certainly, and Sanders did this, Warren, spoke about this. Klobuchar has done this. It's Trump has did this to some extent. Biden has done this, and it's like all bullies. Once they glare at you, and you assume they're going to go after you, and they will go after you in the shadows. But if you fight them in the light, if you fight them out in the public square, they got nothing. They got nothing, So because go after you effectively, they're going to have to break the law, and they're going to have to hire people to break the law. And and there's most folks, they ain't going to do that.
Yeah, I hope so, because I feel like there's a way to go about this, and maybe that's the way we could end this conversation. Is like, what's the vision for you and open markets for how we go about effectively sort of finishing the job? It sounds like there's been incredible progress in the last several years. What does the vision look like? Are we talking about new laws or the enforcement of existing laws? Is it breakups? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's all these things, and it's really, and actually, and you said, you brought up a good sort of opposition, which is, do we need new laws, or can we work with existing laws? And I think a lot of people think we need new laws, and they put a lot of effort into making new laws. New laws would make it easier to move forward. We could move faster. But the fact is that America has this incredible body of existing law that we are using right today to fight these battles. And the reason that we didn't use this law for 40 years was not because it didn't exist. It's because we changed that framework. Remember, that issue of, is the purpose of the law to promote democracy and liberty, or is it to promote the welfare of the consumer by giving the consumer more things? So for 40 years, we said the purpose of these laws is we're going to give the consumer more things. And we forgot all these laws. So now that we've changed, we put on new glasses, we put on new frames, new lenses, and we're looking at the law through different lenses, and we're like, oh my God, these laws are amazing. Americans of the past were really smart. The Constitution is a fantastic anti-monopoly document. And all of the body of law that's built up on top of that to fight monopoly, we have everything we need. So in some ways, the future lies in relearning how to use the tools of the past. And the key thing that we need to keep our minds on is it's going to be a great future. When we relearn how to use these laws from the past, the future becomes ours again. We've kind of lost control of the future. The future belongs to Peter Thiel. The future belongs to Google. The future belongs to Amazon. It's not ours right now. But we can take the future back and make it ours. And we will. And that's what we're doing.
Barry, that's a perfect place to end this. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. I appreciate the work that you and your colleagues do. Thanks for standing up and pushing for what you believe in and making America a better place.
Hey, thanks. It's been great to talk with you. Thanks.